Welcome back. It's time for another deep dive into Lawyering Peace by Dr. Paul Williams. Today we're looking at Chapter 4, which is all about self-determination.
We're going to try to pull out some of the key insights. Why do groups fight for self-determination? How do these conflicts actually end? And is self-determination always the answer?
Big questions.
Yeah. Is it the solution everyone thinks it is? So, to kind of set the stage here, I was blown away by this statistic. Since 1950, over 70 different ethnic groups have resorted to armed conflict.
Wow.
Fighting for either autonomy or full-on independence.
Yeah, there's a lot of unresolved self-determination out there.
70. That's a lot. I had no idea the number was that high. So, I mean, is that something that's resolved, like, relatively quickly, or are we talking, like, decades of struggle?
Unfortunately, it's usually decades. The average ongoing self-determination conflict has been going on for 27 years.
Wow.
Think about it.
That's people's entire lives.
Exactly.
Growing up in this state of conflict, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder, how does it ever end? Is there, like, a magic solution, a magic formula for resolving these types of conflicts?
There's no magic formula, unfortunately. But there are generally three paths to resolution, and they all have their own kind of unique twists and turns. One is military victory.
Okay, straightforward.
Which sounds straightforward, but it can be very messy.
Right.
Sometimes the state wins outright.
Yeah.
Like, Sri Lanka crushed the Tamil Tigers, who were fighting for a separate homeland. But then you have cases like Nagorno-Karabakh.
Okay.
They actually won their war against Azerbaijan.
Okay.
But they remain internationally unrecognized.
Oh, so they're kind of in this weird limbo.
Exactly.
They won, but they're not legitimate in the eyes of the world.
Exactly. Yeah. It's almost like they have to fight a second battle.
Right.
For recognition, even after they've won on the battlefield.
So it's not even a guaranteed happy ending, even if you win the war.
Right. And victory doesn't always go to the state either.
Right.
You look at Slovenia and Croatia, they broke away from Yugoslavia.
Oh, yeah.
They fought, they won, and they got their independence recognized.
So it can go either way.
Exactly. Yeah. But military victory is just one path.
Okay.
And frankly, it's not the most common.
So what's the more typical way these conflicts end if it's not through brute force?
Most often it's through negotiation.
Oh, okay.
And this is where things get really interesting because there's so many potential outcomes.
Yeah.
Sometimes the state manages to stay together, but they figure out some way to share power.
But is that enough to satisfy a group that's been fighting for independence, though?
It depends. There's also the option of transforming from a unitary state to a federal one.
Okay.
Like Yemen attempted to do.
Right.
This gives regions more autonomy, but they're still part of a unified nation.
But what happens if, like, negotiations just totally break down?
Right.
Is there a last resort?
There is a last resort, but it's also the most controversial external self-determination.
What does that even mean?
This is where basically a third party steps in, often through a peace agreement or a referendum.
Okay.
And they give the sub-state entity, that group that wants self-determination, a choice.
Stay or go.
Stay or go.
Okay.
So you have examples like South Sudan splitting from Sudan, East Timor breaking away from Indonesia.
Yeah, those were some pretty intense referendums.
Correct. Yeah.
Those are high stakes.
And they each have their own unique set of complexities.
Yeah.
The UK and Northern Ireland, Serbia and Montenegro.
Right.
All unique situations with varying levels of international involvement. And then you have Kosovo.
Okay.
Which was kind of a special case where independence actually came through a UN resolution.
Through the UN.
Yeah. And then there are proposed processes that never quite happened, like Western Sahara. It's a whole spectrum.
It sounds like each of these cases has its own unique flavor of complexity.
They do.
But you mentioned international involvement a couple of times.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder, does this push for self-determination ever clash with, the sort of rules of the global game?
Oh, absolutely. At the heart of all these conflicts is this fundamental tension between self-determination and what we call territorial integrity.
Okay, now I'm guessing some of our listeners might not be international law experts, so break it down for us.
Sure.
What is territorial integrity, and why does it matter in these situations?
It's a bedrock principle of international law that basically says every country has the right to keep its territory whole.
Okay.
No one can just come in and grab a piece.
Right.
And they shouldn't be encouraging parts of that country to break away. Kind of like a fundamental right to self-defense,
right,
but for a country's land.
So how does that work when you have a group within that country
Right.
that's saying, we want self-determination?
That's where the tension lies.
It sounds like there could be some serious friction.
There is. Even the International Court of Justice, the ICJ,
Okay.
they struggled with this when they were looking at the Kosovo case.
Okay.
They basically said Kosovo declaring independence didn't violate Serbia's territorial integrity.
Okay.
But other countries recognizing Kosovo without Serbia's consent,
Right.
that was a problem.
So it's not as simple as you might think.
Not at all.
International law has some gray areas when it comes to balancing self-determination.
It does.
With keeping countries intact.
Definitely.
So to understand how we got to this point, with all this tension and all these gray areas, I think it helps to look back at the era of decolonization, for much of the 20th century.
Yeah.
You had all these colonies fighting for their independence.
Right.
It seems like that would be a good place to look for some historical precedent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're talking about over 100 former colonies.
Wow.
That achieved independence during that period.
Okay.
Often through referendums, sometimes phased transfers of power.
Okay.
And the UN played a significant role in guiding that whole process.
Right.
One of the key principles that emerged during that period was something called uti possidetis.
Uti possidetis.
Yeah.
That sounds incredibly complicated.
It is basically new countries inherited their colonial borders.
Okay.
It might seem like a boring technicality,
Right.
but it actually shaped the world map as we know it.
Right. Like imagine if every new country had to renegotiate every inch of their border.
Exactly.
Chaos. It makes me think about Algeria's fight for independence from France.
Oh, yeah.
That had to be a long and complicated process.
It was. And the Evian Accords, which ultimately granted them independence,
Okay.
are full of these fascinating details
Yeah.
that really illustrate just how messy these processes can be.
So let's dig into that. What were some of the key elements of those accords?
Well, first of all, they gave Algerians a choice: independence or staying with France
Okay.
through a referendum.
Makes sense.
They also created this interim government,
Okay.
but with France still having some control
Oh, interesting.
over things like defense. It's like they were trying to ease out of the relationship,
Right.
not just make a clean break.
So even though Algeria was moving towards independence, there was still that, presence of the former colonial power lingering.
And then there was another big factor: oil. They discovered oil in the Algerian desert in 1956. France wanted to hold on to the oil-rich territory,
Of course they did.
but the Algerians, understandably, weren't having it. In the end, France did negotiate some pretty favorable deals for their oil company, but it shows how economics gets intertwined with these self-determination claims.
Absolutely.
It's not just about ideals and identity. It's about who controls the wealth.
It's about money, yeah.
And the Accords also addressed other issues, like they had provisions to protect the European population in Algeria,
Okay.
giving them like a 3-year window to decide about their citizenship. And France got to keep some of their military bases,
Oh, wow.
including a lease on Mers el-Kebir. It shows how many different interests are at play
Right.
in these negotiations. It's not just about drawing a line on a map and saying you're independent now.
There's economic considerations, security concerns, the rights of minorities. It makes you wonder how anyone even begins to tackle this kind of process.
Right.
Is there a roadmap?
There is a sort of roadmap. It boils down to 4 major goals
Okay.
that kind of drive these negotiations.
Great. So lay it out for us. What are those 4 goals?
First, the state naturally wants to stay together, if at all possible.
Makes sense.
It's about preserving their sovereignty, their territorial integrity.
Right, right.
On the other side, you have the group that's seeking self-determination.
Yeah.
They, of course, want the option of independence to be on the table.
Right.
But if they do end up staying within the existing state,
Right.
they want strong guarantees
Okay.
for internal self-determination.
So not necessarily a clean break, but a real choice.
Exactly.
And if they choose to stay, making sure they have some meaningful power within the state.
Right. And then you have the mediator.
Okay.
And often the existing government, too. They want to make sure that if independence does happen,
Yeah.
the new state can actually function.
Right. You don't want a failed state.
Nobody wants a failed state.
Yeah. Yeah.
That just leads to more instability, more conflict.
Right, right. It's not just about granting independence for the sake of it.
Exactly.
You've got to set up that new country for success.
Exactly. And finally, all the parties involved, both sides and any mediators, they want to avoid further violence,
Right.
destabilization. And there are 6 key challenges that consistently pop up. during these types of negotiations.
Okay, let's break them down.
First and foremost, they've got to figure out how to share sovereignty.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It's all about who controls what during the transition period.
Okay.
And it's not just some abstract concept.
Right.
It gets down to the nitty-gritty of how a place is actually governed.
So give us a concrete example. How does this sharing sovereignty thing actually play out?
Take Kosovo and East Timor. In both cases, international bodies stepped in.
Okay.
And they basically governed alongside the local institutions.
So what's the next big challenge?
Building institutions. So how do you create a government from scratch?
Yeah.
Or at least make sure the existing one can handle all the changes that are coming.
Right. That means courts, police, ministries.
You're talking about creating everything.
Everything.
From traffic laws to tax collection.
The whole thing.
It's a massive undertaking.
It is. Think about Northern Ireland. Yeah. After the Good Friday Agreement, a lot of the work was about building up their political institutions.
Right.
That could actually support a power-sharing government. But other places, like East Timor or Kosovo, they basically needed a total rebuild. That's where the international community often comes in, offering expertise, resources. But even that can be tricky. You know, look at South Sudan.
Oh, right. Where the international community was so hesitant to be seen as pushing for independence.
Yeah.
That they didn't do enough to support those institutions that South Sudan needed to actually function on its own.
Exactly. And sadly, that lack of preparation really played a role in the civil war that broke out there.
So it's not just about wanting to help, it's about how you help. Right.
Right.
And walking that fine line between providing support and influencing the outcome.
Which brings us to challenge number 3.
Phasing sovereignty.
This is about creating that roadmap, a step-by-step process for transferring power. So you can see this in Kosovo, where the UN, through UNMIK, gradually handed over responsibilities to the Kosovar government based on a set of benchmarks they had to meet. And those benchmarks bring us to challenge number 4. Conditioning sovereignty. This is where it gets even more interesting. It's about setting conditions, those benchmarks, that have to be met before more power is transferred or even before independence is considered.
So it's like saying, look, you need to prove that you can govern responsibly, protect the rights of your citizens, maintain stability before we give you the keys to the kingdom.
There you go.
Right. And a popular approach here has been standards before status, which was used in Kosovo. It emphasized things like human rights, the rule of law, the return of refugees.
So really making sure that a new state is built on solid foundations.
Exactly.
Not just on the desire for self-determination, but who gets to decide what those standards are?
That's a great question. And it leads us to challenge number 5, determining final status, figuring out what the people actually want.
So a referendum.
Right. Seems obvious, but referendums are incredibly complex.
What makes them so tricky?
Well, it starts with who gets to vote.
Right.
You know, do you include people who were born in the territory but now live elsewhere?
Right.
What about residents who aren't considered part of the group that's claiming self-determination?
Yeah, you're essentially deciding who gets a say in their future and who doesn't.
Exactly. And then there's the wording of the question itself. Believe it or not, how a question is phrased can subtly influence how people vote.
Oh, I believe it.
We've seen real-world examples where, seemingly small choices in wording could have completely flipped the result of a referendum. And then you have the threshold for a decision.
Okay.
Is it a simple majority? Do you need a supermajority? Do you need a minimum number of people to even participate?
Right, right.
All these details can be fiercely debated.
It's fascinating how these seemingly technical points have such huge consequences.
Yeah, because remember, this is about people's lives.
Yeah.
Their futures, their sense of belonging.
It's not just some academic exercise.
Exactly. And that brings us to challenge number 6, probably the most controversial, constraining sovereignty. This is the question of whether the international community can limit the actions of a newly independent state, even after it's unrecognized.
So you have state sovereignty on one hand,
right,
but then concerns about whether that new state is actually going to be able to govern responsibly.
Exactly. A good example of this is Bosnia. Even after they gained independence, there was still a high representative in place appointed by the international community, and NATO troops were there. So even though Bosnia was technically independent, there were still limits on its sovereignty, all in the name of stability.
So it's like a safety net.
Right.
So where do we go from here?
Well, We've talked about some of the challenges in negotiating self-determination, but I think it helps to actually look at how those challenges have played out in the real world.
Okay, yeah, let's get into some specific cases.
So we touched on Bosnia earlier, and Bosnia is really a case study in what we call constrained sovereignty. Even after they gained independence, they had to share authority with international actors.
And that was all spelled out pretty clearly in the Dayton Accords.
Exactly. The Dayton Accords, which ended the Bosnian War back in 1995, they established the Office of the High Representative, which was given a lot of power to oversee the peace agreement.
Right, and that wasn't just a figurehead position.
No, not at all.
Like, they had the authority to remove elected officials.
They could.
Impose laws, even take control of media outlets.
Yeah, if they deemed it necessary.
So Bosnia had to give up a lot of control to get peace.
They did. It was part of the deal.
Makes you wonder if it was true independence or just a different form of external control.
That's the question, isn't it?
Right.
It highlights the trade-offs that are often involved in these kinds of peace agreements.
Right.
And it wasn't just civilian oversight either.
Oh, right.
The Dayton Accords also allowed for a NATO-led peacekeeping force
to be deployed
to ensure security. So you had this dual layer of external control.
Civilian and military.
The thinking was that Bosnia, having just come out of this brutal conflict, fueled by all this ethnic tension, they weren't quite ready to manage their own affairs.
Okay, so it was seen as necessary to prevent further bloodshed.
Exactly.
To give peace a chance.
Right.
But then how long can that kind of intervention last?
Right.
At what point can a state really be considered sovereign?
That's the big question. And it's a question that we grapple with a lot in this field.
Because these interventions, even with the best intentions, they can be controversial.
They can.
Lead to unintended consequences. All right, well, let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
And look at Bougainville.
Okay.
They took kind of a different approach. They opted for a phased approach to sovereignty with a referendum on independence set for sometime between 10 and 15 years after their peace agreement with Papua New Guinea.
Which was in 2001?
2001. Okay.
So that referendum actually happened in 2019.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they had this long interim period.
They did.
Where they were given a lot of autonomy.
Right, a significant degree, yeah.
They had their own constitution. Control over their own finances, and the ability to create their own institutions like courts and a police force.
Exactly. And importantly, the agreement included provisions for weapons disposal and benchmarks for good governance. Things like democratic reforms, respect for human rights, transparency.
So it was a pathway to independence.
Oh, essentially, yeah.
But with some conditions.
Right.
It's like saying, we trust you to govern yourselves, but here are some guardrails to make sure things go smoothly.
Exactly, and it seemed to work pretty well.
It did.
Yeah. This phased approach, with its emphasis on building capacity, it allowed Bougainville and Papua New Guinea to rebuild trust, and for Bougainville to show that they could govern effectively.
And it all culminated in that 2019 referendum.
It did.
Where the people of Bougainville voted overwhelmingly for independence. Okay, well, let's look at a case now that was not so peaceful.
Okay.
East Timor,
right.
Their path to independence was quite different.
Yeah, it was.
Marked by a lot of violence.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And a more forceful intervention by the international community.
East Timor's story really underscores the challenges you face when you're trying to achieve self-determination. But there's resistance from the parent state. They held a referendum in 1999 where they overwhelmingly rejected this offer of special autonomy within Indonesia.
So they basically said, no, we want full independence.
They did. And that triggered a wave of violence by pro-Indonesian militias who were backed by elements of the Indonesian military.
It was a terrible situation. Widespread human rights abuses, displacement of people.
It forced the international community to step in.
They couldn't just stand by and watch.
And the UN Security Council authorized a peacekeeping force to restore order.
So in this case, the UN took on a much more direct role.
They did.
Not just as a facilitator, but really as a governing authority during this transition.
Exactly. They established the UN Transitional Administration in East Timor.
So they basically took over.
They had a huge task ahead of them.
Like what?
Rebuilding institutions, restoring basic services, creating the conditions for democratic elections.
You're talking about nation building from scratch.
Yeah, it was an enormous undertaking.
Wow.
And it wasn't without its challenges.
I can imagine.
But ultimately, the UN played a crucial role in paving the way for East Timor's independence.
Which they finally achieved in 2002.
In 2002, that's right.
It's a really powerful example of how international intervention, when done right, can be a force for good.
Protecting
People.
Yeah.
Facilitating self-determination in the face of violence and oppression. Let's move on to another case involving phased sovereignty and international oversight. Kosovo.
Okay, Kosovo.
Kosovo is interesting because the UN took on this unprecedented level of control.
They did, yeah.
After that NATO intervention in 1999. That ended Serbian control over Kosovo. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 1244, which essentially made Kosovo a UN protectorate.
Exactly.
So it was more than just a peacekeeping mission.
They established UN Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo.
Okay.
And they had authority over everything, from the police and the judiciary to economic policy, foreign relations.
Wow, that's a huge responsibility.
It was.
So what was the goal?
The goal was to create the conditions for a peaceful, multi-ethnic Kosovo that could eventually govern itself.
So they were focused on building institutions, promoting human rights.
Yeah. Facilitating a political process to determine Kosovo's final status.
Exactly. It was a long-term project.
Yeah.
And a gradual process.
With the UN slowly transferring responsibilities over to Kosovar institutions.
As they demonstrated that they were capable.
And of course, Kosovo's path to independence wasn't without controversy. Serbia never recognized their declaration of independence back in
2008.
And some other countries, including Russia, have also refused to recognize them.
Okay, well, for our final case,
Okay.
let's look at Serbia and Montenegro.
Right.
Another example of a negotiated separation.
Right.
But this one unfolded much more peacefully.
In 2003, they formed this loose confederation called the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro.
Okay.
As a way to manage their separation from the former Yugoslavia.
So like a trial separation.
You could say that.
Just to test the waters before they went their separate ways.
And crucially, their agreement included a provision for a referendum on Montenegro's independence after 3 years.
So they built in that mechanism from the beginning.
They did. They weren't just kicking the can down the road.
And in 2006, that referendum took place.
It did.
And a narrow majority of Montenegrins voted for independence.
They did.
And Serbia accepted the results.
They did, yeah.
Respected the will of the Montenegrin people.
It was a relatively amicable divorce.
It was, at least as far as these things go.
Right, exactly.
And I think it's interesting to note that Montenegro was already exercising a lot of the functions of an independent state before the referendum.
That's right. They had their own currency, foreign policy.
Wow.
Even a separate army.
So that transition to full independence was pretty smooth.
Relatively smooth, yeah.
Because they'd already laid the groundwork.
They used that period of shared sovereignty
to really get their house in order.
Exactly.
It highlights how a well-managed separation process with clear timelines and a commitment to honoring the outcome can lead to a peaceful outcome.
Absolutely. It's a really important lesson.
All right. So we've looked at all these different cases.
Oh, wow.
And they're all so unique.
They are.
But are there any common threads that you're seeing in how these processes unfold?
That's a great question, and I think one of the biggest takeaways is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to self-determination.
Okay.
Each case is unique, shaped by its own history, its own political dynamics, the level of international involvement.
So you can't just take a cookie-cutter approach.
No, it's more like tailoring a suit.
Okay.
You have to make it fit just right.
Right. It's got to be tailored to the specific circumstance.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that these processes are rarely linear or predictable, sometimes even outbreaks of violence along the way.
Right. Because at the end of the day, we're dealing with human beings.
We are.
With all their complexities.
Exactly. Yeah, and these processes, they tap into really deep feelings of identity, belonging, historical grievances.
Yeah, these are not just abstract political issues.
No, they're not.
They're about people's lives.
Absolutely. And that's why trust is so crucial in these situations. Because without trust, these processes are almost guaranteed to fail. Parties need to believe that the other side is genuinely committed to peace, that they're going to abide by the agreements.
Right.
They need to trust that the international community is acting fairly, not playing favorites.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, the people themselves need to trust that the process is legitimate. that their voices are being heard.
So trust is really the foundation upon which all of this is built.
It is, and it's something that needs to be nurtured and cultivated throughout the entire process.
Yeah.
From the initial negotiations to the final implementation of any agreement.
Right, so it's about building relationships.
It is.
Fostering open communication, demonstrating a real commitment to a shared future. This chapter has been incredibly informative, but it's also left me with a lot of questions.
Me too.
It seems like every answer just opens up new avenues for exploration.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Yeah, you think you've gotten to the core, but there's always another layer underneath.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into self-determination. But the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating world of lawyering peace.